Okay, so this I'm going to continue on the notes here. So this is actually the third series of notes um, for evolution, and we're just continuing on with this same presentation, but I'm going to narrate a little bit. So we're starting back here on this idea of evolution. Let me just remind you that this cartoon is not true; it's false. Um, and these are the questions and assumptions that would be raised from this, but remember that this is not what evolution predicts either. Not what evolution predicts. So, before we start talking about the notes, I do want to respond to a question that I received. Actually, several students emailed me about this question. So I wanted to give you a little piece of information, and I embedded this in the notes already. Maybe that's why people were thinking about it. Maybe these are questions that some students already had. So we're going back to homologous structures, which is one of our forms of evidence. And remember that these are structures that are similar across different species due to common ancestry. So um, we have similar parts, even though they may look a little different. Structurally, they're very similar. But sometimes there are features that do the same thing but have different structures. And so, what about these? What makes what can we make? What kind of sense can we make out of this? And how does this fit into our evolutionary construct of natural selection, evolution, species changing over time, nature selecting which organisms survive long enough to reproduce and pass down their genetic material to the next generation? So how does this fit all into that? And here's some examples. Um, so look back at the definition of homologous structures if you don't know it, like if you can't recite it and really understand it. But remember, a bat wing and a bird wing are homologous structures. They have similar bones. They're colored. I guess I can zoom in a little bit. The phalanges here are in yellow. We've got other homologous bones here, but notice that the green one is not apparent here because it has reduced in size. For some reasons that, if you want to know, please ask in class. But I'm not gonna spend too much time on that. But these bones are very similar between the two species. But sometimes, oops, let me go back. But the insect wing and the bat wings and bird wings are not the same. If you notice the structure is very different, think about what you know about insects. They don't have bones. They have exoskeletons. So these are different in structure, but they both do the same function. So they have different structures, but same function. Homologous structures have the same structure, but may do different functions. Birds and bats do the same thing, but birds and whales don't use these bones in the same way. Insects, even though they have different structures, have been able to function in the same way as these other organisms. So that's what we call analogous structures. And here's another example. We've got our human, bird, porpoise, elephant, very similar to what you saw in the last podcast and in class. Here's the analogy, a bird wing to a fly wing. They're analogous, they're analogies. They're not the same thing, but just as these bones help a bird fly, this wing helps a fly fly. And they're very different structures, but they do the same thing. So we can think of it like an analogy. And so we say that they are analogous structures. So what is the Darwinian explanation for analogous structures? Well, think about these organisms and the environments that they live in. And remember that organisms can't invent new structures. So only if there are certain structures already present, based on lots and lots of years and generations of development, will we see some possibilities for structures that will help that organism take advantage of its environment and survive and reproduce. So is it important for some insects to fly? Absolutely. Well, they don't have bones, so they're not going to develop wing structures in the same way as birds and bats. And so they're going to develop wings from what they already have, but they fit in that environment. So if we still think of the environment as the selector, a non-conscious selector of traits, then those things are just as likely as bird wings and bat wings. It's still the environment that's selecting the traits that help them survive. And hey, we see them today. That means that they've survived at least up till today in this environment. So those are analogous structures, and I just wanted to point that out. So let's go back to Darwin. Now, Darwin didn't have all of that evidence. He didn't have DNA. He had some fossils. He himself did not study a lot of comparative embryology. Again, he didn't know about DNA. So all of that is extra evidence that we've collected since 1859, since he published his book, that only supports his idea, his theory of natural selection. So it's quite interesting that we've collected all this evidence, and we still continue to collect lots and lots of evidence every day that supports this idea. So again, these are the summary of his ideas. You can pause it if you need to, but you've already jotted these down. I would make sure that you start committing this to memory. This is Darwin's idea of natural selection. And in his book, he actually made this comparison that we've talked about in class to the Pogel Model 3 of evolution and selection. The difference between artificial and natural selection. So I have a Venn diagram here. I want you to make sure you can fill this out. Artificial selection is selection in which humans are selecting the traits, and natural selection is when the environment is selecting those traits. Now, if you really think about this, you may be able to argue that artificial selection is really our own. We've made this up in our own mind to think that we are controlling the environment. So if you can think along those lines, and you think you can explain how that might be, let me know, and I'll see what I can do by giving you success passes. But it's going to be the first student in class who gets this right. So spend some time thinking about how artificial selection really may not be a real thing, but a way that humans think we're controlling the environment. So I'm going to zoom in, and natural selection environment selecting, but here in the middle, there is a filtering process from one generation to the next. And that's the idea, is that there are some individuals that are going to survive, reproduce, and pass down their traits. It's just the difference is, in a very classical definition, that artificial is done by humans, natural selection by the environment. So let's look at this real quick and try to understand. As we go down this diagram, we're talking about new generations. We start with one generation, up here at the top in this grayish color. Now this is asexual reproduction. This one organism is dividing into three. There's not sexual reproduction, or there are no two parents, I guess, is an easy, simple explanation, a simple way to describe it. But this one organism produces variation in the next generation. There's a mixing of genetic material. It doesn't always make exact clones. So we've got a light variant, which just represents one extreme of the variation, the middle intermediate variant, and then the darker variant, which just represents the other extreme of variations. Well, this mutation creates variation within the population, but there are some unfavorable mutations that are selected against by the environment. So this one over here on the left, this extreme one over here, gets wiped out. It does not survive. It does not pass down its genetic material to the future generations. But the intermediate and the darker gray ones do survive and reproduce and make offspring. But we know down here that the favorable mutations are more likely to survive. So even though the intermediate ones survive to the next generation, it still is being outcompeted in this environment by this darker colored circle, which represents, some variation in the population, and it continues to reproduce. And this is what we see generation after generation. So we can see from one generation to the next changes in the characteristics in a population of the inherited characteristics. And look back at your definition of evolution. This is evolution in effect. And so we see this all the time from one generation to the next. Now, you might notice that some populations reproduce faster than others. Humans take pretty long compared to bacteria and fruit flies and other things like that can reproduce very, very quickly. And so we can see maybe rates of evolution happening a little faster than we see in the human population or other organisms that have longer periods of time before they can reproduce in their life cycles. So here's some examples of artificial selection. We had our gray wolf, and by selecting certain traits and breeding them, we were able to over a few generations able to create different breeds of organisms. And they're all the same species with different breeds. Obviously, they look very, very different from each other. And humans were able to do this within a matter of a few generations, a few hundred years. And that's a few generations when we look at the whole scheme of the whole timeline of living things on Earth. So Darwin made the argument that if this can happen, this happens in pigeons as well. If this can happen, why can't this happen in nature when nature does the selecting based on environmental conditions? Another example is corn. Here's an example of corn. This is an ancestor of corn, and this is what wild corn looks like. So Native Americans were selecting for the grass that made the biggest seeds, breeding those grasses, making seeds, making kernels that were bigger and bigger and bigger. So we have more or larger seed structures on this corn, which is a food source for us. Also, many of the vegetables that you see at the grocery store, like, I don't know if you know what kohlrabi is, but Brussels sprouts, cabbage, cauliflower, broccoli, kale, all of these things have been artificially selected from the common wild mustard. And based on certain traits that we want in the different vegetables, farmers were able to select the plants that had those traits, breed them, and in essence exaggerate those traits and minimize the other ones, generation after generation after generation. So if you're eating a salad with lots of these different things, it's all actually kind of related to the same. They're all related to each other, which is kind of weird. With natural selection, we've learned about the peppered moths. This variation happened in the environment. We looked at the graph and we saw that the human impact on the environment changed the habitat for these guys and changed the prevalence of the dark-colored moths and light-colored moths depending on the time and the pollution at that moment. So as a warm-up, oh, sorry, we're not quite there yet. Okay, so here's bacterial infections. We looked at this kind of idea as well. Before natural selection, we have lots and lots of different variants of a bacteria. After natural selection, after the environment has changed, and sometimes we even consider that to be when we give ourselves antibiotics, we're changing the chemical environment for these bacteria. Well, it wipes out many of the non-resistant bacteria, but the ones that stay are resistant. You can see on this chart, these oranger and redder colors variants are more resistant. And then after natural selection, these reproduce, they have more environment in which to work, and they take over. And so if we continue in this environment, well, these guys are resistant, they're going to survive, but all we've done is wiped out the non-resistant bacteria. Now, if that's good bacteria, bad bacteria, that's a different story. So, and we can talk a little bit more about antibiotics if you like in class. If you don't know what these are red blood cells, and these are sickle cell red blood cells. So I think it's safe to assume that most of you have these kinds of red blood cells, and maybe a few of you have a few sickle cells, or you know someone who has sickle cell anemia. These are two different variations of red blood cell shape based on the proteins that make them up. And what we see is actually that in some environments, the sickle cell are more advantageous than these donut-shaped red blood cells. But the donut-shaped red blood cells, usually they carry more oxygen around, so it's more efficient when you breathe. These red blood cells grab that oxygen, take it around to your body, to the cells that need them, to every single cell that needs them to make energy. But people with sickle cell do that much less efficiently. Although in environments where there's high amounts of malaria, people with sickle cells out-survive and out-reproduce people with this kind of red blood cell shape. So they out-survive and they reproduce, and therefore we see more sickle cell prevalence in human populations in areas in which there's more malaria, or there's ancestry in environments where there was lots of malaria. So we have sickle cell sickle cell anemia is in higher prevalence for people with African ancestry, so lots of African Americans, people from Southern Asia or East Asia, where there are more swamps, so more still water for mosquitoes to breed and carry around the protists that causes malaria. So we often think of sickle cell anemia as a very bad thing, but it depends on the environment that we're talking about. And it is genetic, so it gets passed down. So in certain environments, we actually see this as a favorable trait, and we see higher prevalence of it. So that's actually natural selection in action. So we've been talking about evolution and natural selection, but we've not talked about new species. So all we've talked about in a small scale is how one population may be modified from generation to generation based on environmental pressures. Speciation is a process of how new species arise. And this is sometimes what happens in evolution. Not all the time, but sometimes. So I want you to look back at this diagram. You did this as part of your warm-up in class. So this is a map of Great Britain, and we've got pie charts all over. We've got this circle that's not filled in is representing the light-colored moths, and the filled-in circle representing dark-colored moths. So if we look at this data point right here, it's completely filled in. That means that 100% of the moths at this location are of the dark variant. If we look over here, 100% of these are of the light variant. But if we look here, we see about 50-50. And so what you see is there are trends that are happening in the moth populations as we move from east to west. From west to east. On the west coast, we see more light-colored or higher populations, concentrations of light-colored moths, and as we move east, we see the light variant decreasing in percentage, whereas the dark-colored moths are increasing. And so what we see is that in different environments, we see different heritable traits and percentages of those heritable traits in the populations. And so, because remember, the wind is moving in this direction, so it's carrying the pollutants from west to east. They're building up on the east coast, making the environment darker, giving an advantage to this dark variant over the light-colored variant. Now let's imagine that these populations stayed isolated. If these remained in this environment and these remained in this environment, over many, many generations, we would see actually, because they're in different environments, these populations moving in different directions genetically. And even after lots and lots of generations and we tried to put them together and they were not able to reproduce and make fertile offspring, then they'd be different species. If they were able to go back together and reproduce and make fertile offspring, then they are still of the same species. So it is very difficult to determine, but I hope that that kind of helps you figure out what it takes to become a new species. It needs to be in a different environment, driven in a different direction by the environment. So there are ways for populations to separate that lead to speciation. So geographic isolation by physically being in different places. Imagine a population of squirrels like in the Grand Canyon, where the Colorado River came through long time ago and separated squirrel populations on either side of the river. Well, in two different environments, there are two different evolutionary pushes based on the environment. So these two populations, two original populations of the same species of the squirrel, have speciated in different directions and now have different genetic material. So even if we were to put them together, they can't reproduce and make fertile offspring. Behavioral isolation is the idea that you're picking different traits, identifying different traits, and therefore, based on that behavior, not reproducing with another population that may be in the same environment, and over lots and lots of generations, your genetic material has gone in different directions and can no longer come back together to make fertile offspring. So think of bird calls. Birds identify each other by their call, even though they're living in the same environment. And then there's temporal isolation, so time. There are flowers in the rainforest that bloom one day a year, and they really are only able then to reproduce with other flowers that are blooming on the same day. And if that continues generation after generation after generation in a non-random way, then each of those flowers are only going to mix with a small subset of the other flowers, and they're going to be driven in different directions genetically based on the timing of their isolation, even though they're living together. So those are the three main ways in which organisms speciate. And let me see what I've got going on here. Okay, so, nope, sorry. So here's a phylogenetic tree of life. We've seen this before. We've got our bacteria, eubacteria kingdom, our archaeobacteria, and our eukarya kingdoms. And notice here are the animals, fungi, plants, and protists. All of these guys are protists. Archaeobacteria in red and eubacteria here in blue. And what we notice is that evolution is going to predict that different species have a common ancestor. So if we look right here, we see that this division, or this divergence of the line from here going to the right all the way up here, that splits into animals, fungi, and plants, indicates that we have a common ancestor. Not that animals are born out of fungi or out of plants, but that we have a common ancestor. Just like we have a common ancestor with modern day monkeys and apes, we see that we're not born from them, but we have a common ancestor, and over lots and lots of generations in different environments, the environment is selected for different traits. So does this mean that animals are have a common ancestor with archaeobacteria? Absolutely, but it's much further back in evolutionary time than our common ancestor with fungi or plants. So our common ancestor with archaea is here. Interestingly, and I hope you notice this, that we have a common ancestor, a more recent common ancestor with archaeobacteria than we do with eubacteria, which is actually kind of mind-boggling and new data in the last, I don't know, about less than 10 years. So it's kind of interesting. But I wanted to show you, let me go back, I'm sorry about that. There's a video that I don't want to embed in here because that's the issue I had with the previous podcast. I don't want YouTube to flag it because it's not, this video doesn't belong to me. So go to YouTube and search for lizard speciation and find a video that looks like this one. This is the first shot of the video, and it's 3 minutes and 22 seconds long. Watch it. It talks a little bit about speciation of lizards in California, and I want you to see if you can understand what's going on here and what's happening to these lizards in different environments, and what kinds of advantages and disadvantages populations have in those environments to drive them to look a certain way or to behave a certain way, and have different DNA so that when they come back together they can't reproduce. Okay? Let me see if that's it. Oh, no, sorry. Gradualism versus punctuated equilibrium. This is the last bit of notes that we're going to talk about in this unit, I believe. So gradualism is this idea of what Darwin told us, that there's slow, gradual changes from one generation to the next. But we notice that when we look at the fossil record, that doesn't explain everything. We don't have all the data to back that idea up. We have a lot. And actually in the 70s, another gentleman by the name of Stephen Jay Gould, G-O-U-L-D, came up with this idea of punctuated equilibrium. Equilibrium means equal, static, staying the same. Punctuated means at certain time intervals, things may be changing. So let me zoom in here to gradualism. So what we see is that over time, that's the y-axis here, over time, the morphology or the shapes or the way organisms look, populations look, changes, and we see that there's slow, gradual changes. They move to the left and the right very slowly, very gradually, and this is what Darwin predicted. But when we look at the fossil record, we don't have, although we have a lot of fossils, there are still a lot of holes in the fossils. And think about what it takes to be a fossil. You got to have an organism that's well preserved and that was not consumed by something else in the food web or decomposed. And so that's very hard to find, especially when organisms are fighting over resources, right? So it's very difficult to make a fossil, and then you have to then know where to look to find them to know what was there. So we don't have a full fossil record, although it's quite there's quite a lot in it. And so we see, so Darwin predicted these slow gradual changes, but the fossil record doesn't necessarily indicate this. So Stephen Jay Gould said that not instead of natural selection, but when the data doesn't point to natural selection, perhaps this theory of punctuated equilibrium is what's going on. That we have static, notice the morphology is not changing, it doesn't move, this line does not move from left to right. This morphology is staying the same, and then it's punctuated, so at equilibrium, it's punctuated by rapid change, and then stays static again. Rapid change, static. This population stays static the whole time. But there's some offshoots here, and what he suggested was that perhaps there were some environmental changes that occurred that caused rapid selections in these populations to modify. And so what you notice here is that this individual doesn't make it all the way to the end of this time. So this individual went, this population went extinct, which means that it was not able to recover and have the genetic variation already in the population to continue to survive that environmental change. Okay, I think that's going to do it for us. Yep, that's going to be it.